It's hard to describe the impact that Jurassic Park had on popular culture in the early 90s. Dinosaurs were always cool, but for many kids, Jurassic Park made them real. They weren't just something you'd read about in a book or see in a Flintstones cartoon anymore. They were big, strong, loud. The draw of these creatures for children was irresistible. The dinosaur craze was in full swing, and companies across the world took notice. Authors wrote books with pterodactyls on the cover. Toy makers cranked out T-Rexes by the thousands. Even the NBA got in on the dinosaur action, with the newly formed Toronto Raptors coming into the league sporting a jersey that remains iconic to this day. In this light, it's not hard to imagine the conversations that took place in the offices of Time Warner Interactive and Atari Games. It was the era of the fighting game, with titles like Street Fighter II and Mortal Kombat dominating the charts both in the arcade and on home consoles. With a seemingly insatiable desire for more games, there was ample opportunity for other franchises to find space within the ever-expanding audience. The logic was simple. Kids love fighting games. Kids also love dinosaurs. So they will definitely love a fighting game with dinosaurs. Do the math.
I remember of yesterday, back before the Great Ones ruled Earth. Before the darkness behind the stars of night, there was a great fire running in the sky. It spread light, the wind hot within its path, destruction for all. The great fire hurled through space, becoming mightier as it burned. None to know the world it portended. Space was filled with old planets and giant tumbling pieces of worlds before, lying in the path of the great fire, until it crashed into a giant old star, exploding everywhere. Streaking asteroids of rock and blinding flame, blue skies burned in the fury of the great fire. All around I hear streets cry out, mountains rumble as the buildings explode. My home erupts. This world will never be the same again. New Earth would rise from the rubble out of the smoky landscape. The cataclysm awakens the sleeping giants from ancient worlds. Crashing through the barriers of time, they invade our world to devastate, to conquer, to rule the whole human race. They rise to devour us, we kneel to worship them. They pause only to seek others for battle, for ultimate world domination. For Primal Rage.
The development of Primal Rage began with Dennis Harper, an Atari vet with several arcade games under his belt. After shipping Moto Frenzy, he found himself wanting to create what he considered a purist kind of video game. The concept of Primal Rage seemed to come quite naturally to him.
It was very strange. I got an idea out of the blue to do a Street Fighter style game, but using dinosaurs, which I thought would differentiate it from all of the other Street Fighter clones coming out at the time.
As if by fate, an artist at Atari had also envisioned such a project.
I had this idea for this T-Rex battle game.
No. I really wanted to do this dinosaur fighting game.
That's right. We both had the same idea at the same time, strangely enough. And Jason brought it to the brainstorming session that year, and everybody thought it was killer.
Jason Leon quickly showed him some sketches he'd made for a very similar style of game, with dinosaurs battling each other in a violent and bloody fashion. With a shared vision in place, Dennis, Jason, and the rest of the team started planning out their prehistoric entry into the fighting game arena. One early consideration related to the game's art style. They wanted to make sure that there was a high level of detail in the game, particularly for the individual characters. The polygonal 3D graphics of the era being used in games like Virtua Fighter were extremely impressive, but were nowhere near advanced enough to render the sort of detail that they had in mind. The choice was made to go with 2D sprites, with a twist. They would be created using models and stop-motion effects, evoking the work of artists like Ray Harryhausen. This approach was initially received with trepidation by the higher-ups at the company, but their fears were laid to rest when the team delivered a concept video cut together using footage from the Laserdisc release of The Valley of Gwenji. After an enthusiastic response, the project was finally in full swing. It wasn't going to be a cheap one though. Creating each character's model, then capturing their individual frames of movement was a slow, expensive process. A Retro Gamer interview with Dennis broke down the process in detail.
Each clay figure was cast in a mould, and the puppet maker then built an intricate, detailed skeleton. The skeleton was then placed inside the mould, which was injected with foam latex that became the beast's skin. A final process of painting and detailing resulted in a posable Primal Rage beast ready for filming.
With an approximate cost of $50,000 per model, it's no surprise in retrospect that the cast of playable characters in Primal Rage was significantly smaller than other fighting games of the era. The advantage, though, came in a unique graphical style, with characters that looked and moved with a great deal of visual flair and individuality compared with other fighting games. Another consideration for the team was how to make the game feel different from the competitors in the genre. After all, fighting as giant dinosaurs is a very different prospect than two humans facing off against one another. The team used Street Fighter II as a base, watching high-level match videos to break down the timing of micro-engagements during each fight, and learn how they contributed to the sublime feel of the game. From here, they would tweak familiar systems, as well as adding some new ones, lending a fresh feel to the game that was still approachable for the genre's existing player base. These changes ended up manifesting in different mechanics during fights, such as being able to consume human followers for additional health. Special moves were also performed using different sorts of inputs to other fighting games. Overall, whilst the game's flow would retain much of what made the genre popular, the team spent a great deal of time and energy imbuing as much distinctiveness into the mechanics of each fight as possible. Finally, whilst the game took a lot of inspiration from Street Fighter II for its game flow and mechanics, it looked towards Mortal Kombat for its presentation. Fights were to be violent and bloody, with even the life bars exploding into gore as they ran down. Like many fighting games of the era, finishing moves that turned your opponent into a pulpy mess were also included. There would be no lack of blood on offer in Primal Rage. With the unique aesthetics in hand and a solid foundation to work from, the team's vision started to take shape. Spirits were high, and the game was coming together nicely. Finally, in 1994, Primal Rage was finished. After months of experimentation and hard work, the game was finally ready to be released to the public. Cabinets were delivered to arcades in August 1994, and Primal Rage was unleashed to a ravenous audience. An aggressive marketing campaign was put in place, ensuring that players around the world knew that a challenger to the fighting game throne was approaching. This was critical, since the local arcade was a crowded marketplace for fighting games around the time of Primal Rage's launch. Atari's new fighter would be sharing floor space with established heavyweights like Mortal Kombat 2 and Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. Additionally, there were other high-profile fighting games being released around the same time as Primal Rage that would also be competing for attention, such as The King of Fighters 94 and Killer Instinct. Luckily, this marketing blitz was enough to give Primal Rage the support it needed to break through the noise and secure a place within the popular arcade fighters of the era. American trade magazine Playmeter reported that Primal Rage was the fourth most popular arcade game in the States during its release. It ranked just barely behind the juggernaut that was Mortal Kombat 2. a remarkable result for an entirely new franchise. The response to Primal Rage from both professional writers and the general public was broadly positive. There seemed to be a widespread appreciation that the game tried to feel different in both tone and mechanics, without straying too far from what made fighting games so popular in the first place. Additionally, the game's presentation was lauded for both its unique visual style and its excellent sound design. However, the feedback was certainly not all positive, and there were some elements that saw the game come up well short of its competition. One immediate issue was the lack of selectable fighters. The cast of dinosaurs in Primal Rage came to just 7 in total. Compare this with other fighting games of the era, and it's obvious that this was a major weakness for the game. It was also difficult to look past the fact that, despite the relatively small cast, there were 2 pairs of character doubles within the game visually. There was the T-Rex pair, Sauron and Diablo, as well as the 2 apes, Blizzard and Chaos. To the casual observer, this made the differentiation between characters much less obvious, and as a result, the already restrictive selection of dinosaurs seemed even smaller. Another major criticism of the game was that there was no true final boss. Consider other fighting games and the characters that lay in wait for you at the end of the ladder. Bosses like M. Bison, Shao Kahn and Idol were legendary, and facing off against them in single player would often draw excited crowds of onlookers in the arcade. You'd expect a title like Primal Rage to have something similar, if not even more ostentatious, to offer. Unfortunately, this was not the case. After a brief minigame where you eat as many followers as possible to regain your health, you faced an endurance gauntlet where you had to beat all of the other dinosaurs in the game again, one after the other. It felt more like the penultimate fight before the climax, not the end of the game. This, combined with the relatively lackluster endings for each character, took the air out of the game somewhat. Interestingly, reports have since surfaced that there was supposed to be a final boss after all, Necrosun, the god of death. This helps explain the graveyard in the background of the endurance stage, since it would have perfectly fit his character. Unfortunately, Necrosun never made it into the first Primal Rage, and was instead pushed to be the antagonist in the sequel. More on that later. Perhaps the most controversial aspect of Primal Rage was its control scheme, or more specifically, how special moves worked. Most fighting games use similar inputs for special moves, generally centered around a combination of directional movements, followed by a button press. Primal Rage took a different spin on this, requiring players to hold the action button down first, then input the movements. It was intended to differentiate the game from its competition, but ended up being awkward for players to get accustomed to. In practice, it felt a bit like the negative edge technique from games like Street Fighter II, but in those titles, it was an optional advanced technique, whereas in Primal Rage, it was the only way to pull off special moves. Dennis himself admitted that this choice had been a misfire.
The system we came up with is unique, but honestly, if I had to do it over, I'd do things differently. In hindsight, it's more satisfying smacking a button to attack your foe than it is to move a joystick.
This particular issue would be addressed in subsequent arcade revisions, whereby more conventional controls were added for special moves, in addition to the originals. This actually led to some extremely interesting developments in combo inputs and competitive techniques, as detailed in this fantastic video by Ketchup and Mustard. Despite these flaws, Primal Rage was still a huge success in the arcades, drawing attention for its high-quality presentation and unique fighting mechanics. It was a genuinely fresh take on the genre, and felt like it could be the start of yet another long-lasting fighting game franchise. The characters and visual splendour attracted casual players as they passed by the cabinet, but the variety of systems on offer and the depth of each playable character ensured that there would be a vibrant competitive scene on offer as well, for those who wanted to invest more time in the game. As with any fighting game though, life in the arcade came at a premium, for both the publisher and for those playing it. For Primal Rage to truly take the next step, it had to come home. Fighting game ports to home formats in the 90s were extremely interesting, since they often had to deal with vast discrepancies in both power and controls compared to the equivalent arcade hardware. As a result, developers had to find creative ways to cut down titles, whilst keeping the core gameplay as close to the arcade version as possible. Oftentimes this came down to presentation, removing animation frames, reducing sprite sizes, crunching down voice sample quality, and other things along those lines. Primal Rage was an excellent example of this, as Time Warner Interactive made sure to release a version of it across as many different formats as possible. Home consoles, handhelds, computers, even the Tiger R-Zone. Okay, calling that last one a port is a bit of a stretch, but the others all made an earnest attempt at emulating the arcade experience. Primal Rage was a third-party title, and as such, not bound to a particular hardware manufacturer. That meant all of the popular systems of the era could, and would, receive a port of the game. There are a multitude of differences between the various ports of Primal Rage as a result, but for convenience's sake, we'll combine them into 4 groups. We'll start with what was likely the most important audience at the time of Primal Rage's release. It was critical for Primal Rage to have a high-profile showing on both Sega and Nintendo hardware, despite the vast difference in power between their offerings and the original arcade board. Cuts and downgrades were inevitable, but it would be important to preserve as much of the game's unique feel and presentation as possible. Probe Entertainment worked on Primal Rage for both the Mega Drive and the 32X, which will be bundled with the 16-bit consoles for the purposes of this overview. Sadly, the Mega Drive version of Primal Rage was quite disappointing. The cuts to the game's presentation were even worse than you'd expect. Everything was affected. The sprites were tiny, the colours were reduced, the sound was muffled. This hit to presentation was marginally improved on the 32X version, but was still a significant step down from both the arcade and some of the other ports. Perhaps most bizarrely, the gameplay was different to the other versions. For some reason, it seems that Probe developed the Sega ports based on an earlier version of the arcade ROM. The main impact was that the combo routes were limited, with many that worked in the later arcade release absent in the Sega ports. Whilst the graphical downgrades were understandable, this seemed more like carelessness. The Super Nintendo version was developed by Bitmasters and came out a little better than Probe's Sega efforts. This version had a built-in advantage, with the standard Super Nintendo controller having more buttons available than the Mega Drive controller, and being much more appropriate for fighting games as a result. It also had a more varied colour palette, making for a slightly more pleasing presentation overall. It still fell well short of the arcade version though. It was also a noticeable step down from the Super Nintendo port of Killer Instinct, which hit shops about the same time. Weirdly enough, it also censored Chaos's Golden Shower Fatality. Classic 90s Nintendo. Overall, these ports were necessary, but in retrospect, pretty awful. They lose the spectacle which helped the arcade game stand out, without having enough meat left on the bones to back it up. Computers were not left out of the party, as Primal Rage saw ports to both the Amiga and to MS-DOS. Like the consoles, these versions came from different developers. The Amiga version was developed again by Probe, so unsurprisingly shares a lot of DNA with their Mega Drive port. Unfortunately, this one is even worse, with all of the flaws of their Sega attempts, with the additional difficulties brought forth by the lack of buttons available on most Amiga joysticks. Trying to control Primal Rage with only 1 or 2 buttons was torture, and really made an already trimmed down version feel even worse to play. In comparison, the MS-DOS version was actually quite good. Developed by Teeny Weeny Games, it was by far the most arcade accurate of all the ports looked at so far, with big sprites and smooth gameplay. The additional power on offer is apparent here when comparing it with other ports, in spite of its annoyingly low resolution. It's not arcade perfect, but it is a perfectly respectable attempt. The Primal Rage port started coming out at a bit of an awkward time. The transition to 32-bit consoles was not yet complete, but the existing cartridge-based consoles were quite long in the tooth and clearly underpowered. As a result, the various CD-based ports were significantly better than those to older hardware, but did not always receive the same attention from the public as the releases to those aging consoles. Primal Rage on the 32-bit consoles felt a little out of date compared with the more pure next-generation fighting games like Tekken or Virtua Fighter 2. It's a shame, as for most people, these ports were the best way to play Primal Rage at home for quite a long time. Probe handled all of these CD releases, so they're all relatively similar, with decent presentation and reasonably accurate gameplay reminiscent of the arcade. Most of these versions also featured additional FMV sequences, as was basically compulsory for CD-based releases at the time. There were cuts to the character animation compared to the arcade, but nowhere near as noticeably as in the ports to the older generation of consoles. The biggest issue across the board were the loading times, which was a fairly common issue for fighting games on CDs during the era. The Saturn version was actually released much later than the other equivalent ports, coming out in mid-1996 in the West and, absurdly, in 1998 in Japan. Apparently, resources were pulled from the Saturn version to get the other ones done. Perhaps the most interesting was the Jaguar CD port. Though it was missing the FMV of the other CD versions, and the sprites were smaller than the arcade version, it was nevertheless a decent attempt that offered Jag owners a taste of the arcade on their Black Behemoth. It was generally considered to be the best fighting game available on the system, though admittedly, that wasn't a high bar to cross. Unfortunately, Jaguars were thin on the ground to start, and those with the CD expansion even more so. It would have been interesting to see what Primal Rage could have looked like on a Jaguar cartridge release, but the CD version remains a great addition to what is otherwise a very anemic library of fighting games for Atari's embattled console. Finally, the curiosity of the handheld ports. Like the majority of fighting games that saw ports to the underpowered handheld consoles of the day, Primal Rage existed more for those who didn't know any better than those who wanted anything even remotely resembling the gameplay of the arcade. The cuts to the visuals and sound are obvious and understandable. The biggest issue here is the absurdly choppy gameplay. Whilst many fighting games on handheld consoles suffered in similar ways, in Primal Rage it is so bad that it makes the game feel almost unplayable. Ironically, Killer Instinct comes into the frame again to show up the poor quality of the Primal Rage port. The Game Boy version of KI was smooth, responsive, and overall leagues ahead of Probe's attempt at a Primal Rage port. Both the Game Boy and Game Gear versions are abysmal. They look bad, sound broken, play horribly, and to top it off, are missing Vertigo, one of the most interesting characters. This brings the playable cast down to a miserable total of 6. If you have to play one of the two, the Game Gear version at least has some colour to help make the character sprites stand out from the backgrounds a bit. Otherwise, both of these versions are absolutely terrible, and are interesting only in showing just how bad fighting game ports usually were for the handhelds of the era. The ports of Primal Rage varied wildly in quality and accuracy when compared with the arcade. This wasn't a huge surprise given the power discrepancy between the systems, and it was something that people had become accustomed to when it came to ports from the arcade in general. What was surprising though, was how difficult it turned out to be to get a true arcade quality experience at home, even several years later. The Saturn version of Primal Rage was the last official home version for years. Even as the arcade emulation scene picked up pace and programs like MAME brought otherwise inaccessible arcade versions home, Primal Rage was still an oddity. Emulation was hit and miss, mostly due to the copy protection built into the original arcade hardware. This meant users suffered from glitchy graphics and audio, as well as moves and combos that were simply inaccessible. Eventually, the arcade version of Primal Rage would be included on Midway Arcade Treasures 2, for the PlayStation 2, Xbox, and GameCube in 2004, with a similar inclusion in Midway Arcade Treasures Deluxe Edition for the PC in 2006. Most of the footage in this video is from the GameCube release. Although this was certainly the most accurate attempt yet, there were still issues plaguing the version of Primal Rage available in these games. It seemed that the emulation was imperfect, causing strange bugs and timing issues that were not present in the arcade. Close, but no cigar. As a result of all of this, the only way to play a truly arcade-perfect version of Primal Rage was to find an arcade cabinet. Unfortunately, this copy protection issue has had the unintended consequence of tainting the game's reputation with many players, as they have only ever been able to play Primal Rage via one of the compromised ports. Even the later ports to vastly more powerful consoles like the GameCube and PlayStation 2 suffered from emulation inaccuracies, leading to gameplay mechanics that felt sloppy and incomplete compared with the initial arcade release. It's a great example of the importance of game preservation, as Primal Rage would have likely been even more fondly remembered if it had been easier for players to access over the years. For all its quirks, Primal Rage was a huge success financially, both in the arcade and on its home release. This was supported by an onslaught of merchandise that, according to some reports, ended up being even more profitable than the game itself. There was, of course, the usual paraphernalia that came from a major multi-platform release, such as clothing and posters. There were also some other really interesting bits and pieces that were available to Primal Rage fanatics that went beyond the norm. Playmates brought out a board game in 1994 called Rage on Earth. You select from one of the 4 available dinosaur gods, then bet your followers against each other in battle scenarios. Playmates also released a line of action figures, which are difficult to find in good condition today, but certainly look good in screenshots. Interestingly, it seems like they may have had excess inventory in the end, since eagle-eyed fans noticed that they were sneakily re-released as part of the line for Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2003. Blizzard vs. Raphael, huh? Now that's the kind of crossover game I'd like to see. Tiger Electronics was another major partner during the Primal Rage franchising blitz. They released a fairly traditional LCD minigame, of course, as was the norm for basically any major game franchise they could get their hands on back in the day. More fascinating though, was that they also released a Primal Rage cartridge for their abominable R-Zone hardware. It supposedly played almost exactly the same as the standalone version, but is still worthy of mention for just how brilliantly unnecessary it was in hindsight. There was also a 4-issue comic book miniseries, published by Sirius Entertainment. It gives a more detailed look at the alliances formed between major characters as they and their followers go to battle against each other. Diablo is a major focus, with his victories over the other characters setting him up as the main threat, until finally being overcome by Blizzard in the final issue. Interestingly, a character called Slashfang appears near the end of the story. This character was set to debut in the upcoming sequel, which was also promoted on the cover of the first issue. The comics, which started their release in late 1996, were clearly intended to be part of the promotional rollout for the second Primal Rage game. Sometime later, a novel arrived called Primal Rage: The Avatars. This story expanded the world of Primal Rage, going into detail about the revival of the dinosaur gods and their relationship with their chosen human acolytes, otherwise known as their avatars. It also introduced Necrosan, the dinosaur who had supposedly been planned as the final boss for the first game. Eventually released in 1997, the novel is a retelling of the storyline of both Primal Rage and its cancelled sequel that expands on the overall universe and bridges the narrative gap between the two games. You will have noticed that we just mentioned the cancelled sequel. Considering the massive success of the first game, it was clear early on that a sequel would be on the cards. By 1996, the promotions had started, as we saw earlier on the cover of the first issue of the comic book miniseries. Primal Rage had secured a good foothold in the market with the first game, so the path was laid for the second game in the franchise. A prototype version of the game was even tested at the popular Golfland arcades in California, where players were first introduced to the new human characters and the upgraded battle mechanics. Things seemed to be going relatively smoothly in preparation for a 1997 release. And then, nothing. News about the sequel dried up, and, outside of the novel, Primal Rage quietly slipped away from the public. It was, and still is, a mysterious turn of events. Was it something to do with Midway's purchase of Atari games from Time Warner? Were there concerns about the game's quality compared to the competition? Did they run out of modelling foam? With these questions lingering in the air, the game took on a somewhat mythical quality within the fighting game community. Eventually, bits and pieces started leaking out. Videos of uncovered prototype builds, ROM sets that weren't playable on the existing versions of MAME, random appearances of the cabinet at trade shows. There were two big breakthroughs though. The first was in 2014, where Galloping Ghost Arcade secured a prototype cabinet of Primal Rage 2 for their floor. It added to an already impressive lineup of games available at the Illinois institution, providing visitors with a tantalizing glimpse into just what might have been. Just a few years later, the emulation scene finally caught up. MAME for Rage 2 was released in 2017, allowing players at home to start exploring the game at their leisure. Recently, Primal Rage 2 has also become playable in the official MAME releases as well. It's still buggy and missing features, but it's playable enough to get a good sense of what the final game would have been like. Primal Rage never really left the 90s. Outside of the occasional mention in interviews and fighting game retrospectives, there seems to be very little appetite from the wider industry in reviving the prehistoric cast for another round. Even the interest brought on by the prototype of the sequel becoming playable a few years ago never translated into any real activity, which is a bit of a shame. It would have been great to see a Star Fox 2 type situation, where Primal Rage 2 was polished up and released to the public. It would be like closing up an unfinished chapter to an otherwise solid book. There is always hope though. Although it was a foil to Primal Rage in the past, Killer Instinct actually provides some hope here. It was revived in 2013 to great acclaim and retains a dedicated fanbase to this day. Whilst it was modernised in many ways, the core gameplay and aesthetics remained faithful to what people loved about it in the 90s. A modern version of Primal Rage could take a very similar path. Alternatively, it's possible to feature in other fighting games these days, due to the popularity of guest characters across franchises. Imagine a combat pack for a future Mortal Kombat game, where Blizzard or Vertigo steps from the shadows to tear the human combatants to shreds. This would be an ironic twist of fate, since Midway supposedly would not allow Mortal Kombat characters to feature as secret fighters during Primal Rage 2's development. Having a prehistoric guest character in a modern Mortal Kombat would be a nice, low-risk way for things to come full circle, particularly with the Primal Rage cabinet already having made an appearance as an Easter egg in Mortal Kombat 11. Some good news is that recent developments in the emulation community have shown significant progress on getting an arcade-perfect version of the original Primal Rage preserved, so hopefully one day soon we can sleep easy knowing that the true arcade experience will never be lost, even as old PCBs continue to break down.
Rage.
Regardless of whether anything new does eventually come around, it's still important to acknowledge the impact that the first game's release had on the industry. It was a bold, original spin on the genre that took more risks than it probably needed to. Primal Rage went toe-to-toe with the established titans of the genre, and, for a brief moment in time, held its own. Despite its relative obscurity in the modern age of fighting games, it still has enthusiastic fans who produce competitive matches almost 3 decades after its release. How many fighting games can claim that level of dedication?